Hello, everyone. I am Mathew Solnik, and I am here to talk to you today about cellular exploitation on global scale, rise and fall of the control protocol. So, the focus of this talk is to, analyze the carrier-mandated remote control and management functionality that is built into over now 2 billion cellular devices. I'm going to talk about the different security issues that found after finding this little thing, and finally demonstrate and talk through a few of the different ways that code execution can be obtained using over-the-air attacks. So, a little bit about my background. I am a security research scientist at Accuvant Labs in the Applied Research Division. Kind of my actual background is mobile and embedded device security and exploitation. Also focus in cellular M2M space. And in 2011, worked on the first over-the-air public demo of a car hack. And I would like to thank my co-researcher, Mark Blanchie, who's not here today. He greatly helped with ROP generation, Android tracing, and a lot of the fun exploitation parts. So, how did this research begin? Well, kind of doing something that I know very few of you like to do. I actually read a sales manual. And in that manual, it said, if you have forgotten to enable over-the-air command console, please let us know, and we can enable it for you. To me, that immediately stuck out as, how the hell is that happening? And unfortunately, that led to about a year-long rabbit hole of research. Okay, let's get into it. So, the rise of the control protocol. Overview of carrier controls. A little bit about the history, prior standards. So, we found that these carrier controls are more or less mandated by what's called the Open Mobile Alliance. It's a standards body that pretty much comes together and makes up a bunch of different standards from OMA, SIM, OTA, just lots of random cellular and other stuff. This originally seemed to have started with a protocol called OMA-CP, which is client provisioning. It's originally some public research about it by MSec Labs in 2009. It's used mostly in GSM networks, so here in Europe, you'll see a lot more of that. Then there's also OMA-SA, or PA, and OMA-SP, which is mostly for CDMA networks. These are kind of older legacy protocols, still partially used, but we'll talk a little bit about that more later. Now, the current standard, OMA device management. Up until about a year ago, a little more than that, I had never heard of this. Yet, it's on over 2 billion cellular devices. It's an amalgamation of the previous protocols I talked about with some new interesting features. Now, carriers themselves are the ones who define how it's supposed to work on the device. They tell the manufacturer that, hey, we want this certain functionality or that, and what feature sets are used. So going forward, technically these feature sets are called management objects. Now, each implementation, carrier, manufacturer, is very different, sort of. So let's talk a little bit about the different kind of management objects that are available. Not sure how well you can see, but a quick overview. We have things like FUMO, which is firmware over-the-air management. If you have an Android device and you've updated it, chances are it was going over OMA-DM. CONMO, connection management. This is how the carriers reconfigure different cellular settings on your device, things like APNs, band channels, IMS credentials, voice over Wi-Fi. Plenty of different options there. Now getting into the more interesting ones. LAMO, which is lock and wipe management, gives the carriers the ability to remotely lock, factory reset, wipe, power cycle your phone, and more. Device capabilities management. It's a lot like a MDM. You can enable or disable the ability to encrypt your device, the ability to use your GPS, the ability to use Bluetooth, turn it on in some cases. Diagnostics management, another interesting one. Find out what the different RF settings are, battery status, memory usage, running processes list, and more. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Carrier IQ. And finally, one of my favorites, SCOMO, Software Component Management Object. The ability to install, remove, activate, and deactivate software applications. That means control the software installed on your phone. So I'm going to start off with a little demo. Unfortunately, because of resolution, it's not that easy to see. Not sure how well y'all can actually see it, but pretty much, because I can't even see it on mine. I'll just come over here. These are, for what you can see, what a carrier would see. You have a bunch of different settings of the phone, things, most of which are controlled. At the bottom, you have things like what the local Wi-Fi networks around the phone are, to what the browser settings are, what your home page is, things like that. This is literally the carrier's view into your cellular devices. There gets to be some interesting ones, like these are call intercept. This allows for the dialing of certain numbers to be redirected, or what I like to use it for, intent proxies. Plenty more that can be found, but I think that's probably enough to show you for now. Okay, so let's go into some actual device and client information. Devices with OMA-DM. So I originally started looking at this in the US, at US carriers, and that's where most of my original research started. But decided to branch out and look at other carriers, pull down ROMs and network information from carriers all around the world, and found that in many cases, this is far from just a US issue. And in some countries, it is much more prevalent even than the US. So we'll talk about a little bit of the different platforms. iOS, currently just a US issue, or US usage on Sprint. But that doesn't mean it won't be coming in other platforms. Carriers are actively deploying this more and more. It is new to many of them, and if one company was able to convince it, maybe others will. Android. Now, Android is another story. It is very prevalent across the world on Android. You name carrier, a lot of them have it. BlackBerry, not so much. Rest of the devices, yeah. You can find it. Again, very carrier specific, so you'll have to look at what kind of device you have, what carrier you're on. Oh, yeah, and for me, one little fun part is it is now being deployed in vehicles as a method to update your ECU firmware over the air. Okay, let's talk a little bit about where the actual client lives, if you're wanting to look for it. So on phones, it's located usually within the userland OS. So, within Android itself, iOS, Windows Mobile. But one nice thing about this application tends to have very privileged access to the baseband. So talking direct channels, communication to the baseband, a lot of times the data that coming into your phone will be directed at that level to the OMA-DM client as opposed to going through standard OS. Now, M10 and IoT devices. Many of them run the actual code within the baseband itself. It's, kind of a just chip with a bunch of stuff in it, and they just stuck the OMA-DM client right in there too. Other devices, laptops, hotspots, things like that. I'm sure a bunch of y'all are using a cellular hotspot because you're afraid of the Wi-Fi networks here. Well, good chance that that has a very, very heavy implementation of this. Anyways, some of them have it in userland, some in baseband, some are mixed. So you're going to have to look for yourself. OK, let's talk a little bit about the Reference Toolkit. Most OMA device management clients are based on what's called the SyncML Reference Toolkit. It's an open source, unrestricted license. It was originally meant as just a proof of concept. The code was released in like 2004 just to show companies, hey, this is how you could use SyncML. It was not intended, based on documentation I've read, to actually be used on production devices. But that's not quite the case. Now, even though it is open source, there are different vendors. One client vendor has nearly complete market dominance. RedBend Software, company I've never heard of before. They have and produce a client called the vDirect Mobile OMA-DM client. It is based on the SyncML toolkit. And they currently have about 70 to 90% market share of the OMA client market. So pretty much 70 to 90% devices are running the same code base. Clients, so what's provided from RedBend, are typically provided as binary blobs. That means the OEMs and manufacturers do not necessarily know what this code fully does. That includes baseband manufacturers. There are also two major release versions, v4, v5, that we'll talk about a little bit later. Oh, and they're heavily promoting the use of SCOMO for automotive ECU updates. Here's a very small, somewhat outdated list of the type of devices RedBend currently runs on. You may have seen it before. Anyways, that's just a sample. OK, let's dig into this, get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to go over the network design and actual communications. So here is the network architecture diagram. Pretty much the basic network style is using a WAP push from the carrier, sent to the device. Device receives it. If the carrier chooses to, it will notify the user. Otherwise, they will be silent. The device will then connect back to carrier servers, receive their updated configs, or use the management or perform any management tasks that were asked. Back and forth, fairly straightforward, somewhat. So let's talk a little bit about security based on the standard. It's as it's written. Mutual authentication is required. OMA device management protocol layer has two types, technically. There is digest, which is pretty much just a digest of a client ID and a shared secret. Then there's a HMAC MD5, which is eject MD5 client secret plus a nonce. TLS or SSL in a lot of cases. According to standard, if the transport layer does not provide authentication, each request must be encrypted. You have a couple different options regarding integrity and more advanced SSL or encryption usage, which I mean, on paper doesn't sound too bad. Could be secure. Well, let's go into a little bit about what some of the initial over-the-air payload types are. So we have network-initiated alerts. These are very small WAP payloads, typically, that are used just to wake up the client. The carrier sends it, and the device phones home. We have DM Bootstrap and CP Bootstrap. These are over-the-air Bootstrap payloads. We're going to talk about this a little more in a couple more slides. So I'll give you an example of what an NIA looks like. As I said earlier, they're just used primarily to wake up the client. It's like, hey, need you to talk to me, talk to your server. It can be sent over a bunch of different bearer types, seen it over SMS as well. Basic format is shown there. We have header, trigger body, trigger, and what's supposed to be the digest in there. At the end of it, there is also the server identifier. This allows a user or a carrier to ask the client to talk to different servers depending on what's configured. Now, getting into what I find more interesting, especially in Europe and kind of more globally, DM Bootstrap. So this is used for initial device provisioning, but can also be used for device reprovisioning. Here is a WBXML representation, which is on the left, what would primarily be coming in once you've converted it from WAP PDU. And you have syncML representation to make it a little bit easier to understand. So what's interesting, kind of note, this is much more heavily used on a global scale than it is in the US. Only one carrier in the US uses it, but because of GSM network design out here, this is used a lot more heavily. So let's go into the actual client-side analysis. So pretty much, the client will communicate with the server. It will receive WBXML commands that are pretty much just binary versions of syncML. The commands are executed against what's called the DM tree. Those are a couple of the different kind of URI examples. So different commands, though. And these are the fun ones. You can get, alert, add, replace, delete, copy, and exec. Talk a little bit about what those would mean later, but an example listed is if I wanted to run an exec on the LAMO operations lock, that would effectively lock your device. If I wanted to get your CDMA password HJ, which is your password for your CDMA network authentication, that would provide it to me as well. So, big graph of the many, many layers of client-side parsing. Originally, the data will come in over the RF cellular network. It's parsed by the baseband. Baseband will then pass it up to userland, typically over an AT or QMI connection. It'll pass the actual data as well as some metadata. OS userland will then reparse the data. So if you're on Android, get sent via the RIL. It'll parse it, see, hey, I need to pass this data to the DM client. It'll then send an intent to the DM client. On iOS, you have Comm Center, which will parse all this. It'll then pass it to what's called DM Helper. From there, you have two major types of payloads or package types. So the over-the-air Bootstrap that we talked about earlier, or a network-initiated alert. The Bootstrap will, after received, go directly into the WBXML parser and be able to start changing settings, whereas the network-initiated alert just tells the device to connect home, and it'll then begin what's called the package one process and start communications with the server. And there's a bunch of different layers. You have WBXML, SyncML, and multiple DTDs under here. You know, we're talking a total of like 8 different parsers in this little client. Lots of attack surfaces. Okay, talk a little bit about cellular testing hardware I use. So I am a huge fan of the Nano BTS. The OpenBSC project is really high quality open source code. It's hard to beat. I have a lot of respect for those guys, and if you're wanting to do any kind of GPRS testing, I definitely recommend taking a look at it. If you're wanting to do WAP or SMS-based testing, it's built-in SMPP interface. Awesome to use. I also have a usurp B210, have run OpenBTS on it, as well as Osmo BTS, or had some issues with stability, though Balint, who will be talking, I believe, 2 talks after me, will probably be able to straighten all of that out. So you should definitely check out his talk on playing with OpenBTS. Now, also, femtocells. Femtocells are awesome. They typically are better performance than your BTS. They're cheaper. But most BTSs are 2.5G. Femtocells 3. Anyways, here is a little picture of a very small amount of my testing gear. This is probably 1/4 of it. But you can get an idea of some of the stuff we get to play with. So let's talk a little bit about identifying the actual control clients. So where are these? How do I find them? How do I look at them? Now, on iOS, it's pretty easy. Just profile any service that might be talking to Comm Center. There's not too many of them. You can find where it is that way, as well as potentially future services. BlackBerry, it's a little bit different. When I first started looking at it, what I did was I pulled apart the bar files, which are pretty much the install, and saw what kind of clients were in the actual radio package. Windows Mobile, read the docs. They got a great website covering all their documentation on this. Android. So Android, as usual, has a huge amount of fragmentation, and you're going to have interesting times finding it. I've seen many different implementations, some obfuscated, some not. Pretty much, you're going to have to start at the beginning. Just look for anything that can take a WAP intent or raw data and standard SMS intents. Also, audit anything that's talking to the row. You have QC row hook, OEM row hook, DM agent for HTC fans out there, and SecRow client. SecRow client, some of y'all might remember from the Synogen mod news a while back. Dude wasn't 100% wrong. Just understanding of how it worked wasn't 100% either. Okay, so let's talk about embedded devices a little bit. So embedded would be any kind of IoT or whatever type of little device that's not a phone. Pretty much, you can start with the baseband, throw it into IDA, see what you see. It's going to take a lot of time. You can then, or grep for strings, probably faster. Just see if you can find anything that is using WAP, SyncML, WBXML. Quick, though not super effective. Once you start getting deeper in, you can trace any of the UART ports see what kind of communications might be going between baseband and application processor. If you have to, drop it into JTAG. Or my favorite, BTS-based testing. I will just throw any kind of cellular device on my personal networks and start pounding it with different kinds of payloads, see how it reacts. Or just sit and wait, and typically they will connect back after a certain amount of time to see, hey, am I supposed to get an update? So you can see it that way. Okay, let's talk a little bit about simulating cellular environments. So not everyone has access to a BTS. I'm going to talk about a couple ways you can play around with this stuff without one. Pretty much the easiest on, like, say, an Android device or even iOS would be to hook and modify the methods used by the actual applications to determine the cellular state. So you can have a device that's off, or not off, but in airplane mode. If you hook the right methods, it'll think it's connected to an LTE network. What we did is modify the methods on Android as well as custom hooks in different OMA clients and tell it was on a cellular network when it was really just on Wi-Fi, and did a bunch of testing just over Wi-Fi. Can also just programmatically send WAP pushes or any kind of other information locally. So no over-the-air actual testing would be required, and makes for much faster fuzzing. Some people will talk about fuzzing SMS and WAP using a BTS. Unfortunately, that typically would take months because you get about 5 SMS a minute. So now the fun part begins. The fall of the control protocol. Let's talk about a little bit the potential attack platforms. So this is a little bit different from the Black Hat USA slide. In the US, I am not allowed to test and do not test on any kind of carrier network. All of mine is private. Also, US carriers heavily filter and prevent any kind of data that could be dangerous from going over their network. But that has not been necessarily the case as proven by other researchers in non-US networks. Plenty of research has been done and published on the ability to send WAP push using devices, such as device-to-device WAP push. You can also use third-party WAP interfaces. And if you like playing with M2M, UDP ports work well too. So what that means is, on a global side of things, devices can be a lot more vulnerable because my device can attack yours or my laptop or whatever. Makes it very easy. A lot of the time, no proximity needed. Now, also what I find interesting is the new generation networks. So LTE have very, very different network design than previous. They're pretty much big data networks that are very close to, say, more the internet as opposed to cellular style design. That means the attack surface actually could be much easier because we're talking things like basic TCP/IP, SIP, VoIP, anything like that is much more easily understood than some of the low-level network protocols required on GPRS or GSM itself. Okay, another potential attack platform. Rogue base stations. This is what I pretty much use at home in an RF shielded environment. Though they can be very effective. My 2.5G, so Edge base station, can be used to attack LTE cellular devices, including global phones which support both LTE and CDM, or GSM and CDMA. It's pretty straightforward. You jam the devices off of LTE 3G, get them down to your base station on 2.5. 90-something% of devices still will automatically drop down to GSM or GPRS. To improve things, you broadcast certain neighboring information. These devices get confused, and even though they may have come from a CDMA LT network, if they support global mode, they will, chances are, drop down to your base station. Though it wouldn't be stable for very long, but enough to do what you need to. One little trick I like, it's called being a good neighbor. Use multiple BTSs to broadcast cellular network information. Pretty much, instead of using a single BTS, become your own carrier. And in that, I mean, lots of BTSs propagating the information. If it all looks good to the device, very high chance of camping. And finally, you have femtocells. They are also extremely effective. I play with them less as you are on carrier backhaul, but if an attacker were wanting to, he could use these. They are typically, as I said earlier, higher tech than most of my BTSs or most affordable ones, such as 3G. And you won't have as many camping issues as they really are carrier networks. Okay, going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities. So let's talk about authentication again. Originally, we said that the OMA-DM client uses credentials based on a combination of two things. Well, a client ID and a shared secret token. In just about every implementation I have looked at, the client ID is your IMEI or MEID, and the shared secret token is static across all devices of a single carrier. That means that your IMEI, which is broadcast openly over cellular networks, I can literally sit and sniff it out, and a secret token that is on every device of your carrier, such as the contents of the ROM, I can now have the credentials for your phone. That's it. So occasionally you'll find that they're using HMAC, but it can be downgraded if you need to. So unfortunately, not much authentication left. Now, in the cases of SSL, so US seems to use SSL more, worldwide a little bit less, but okay, we'll give it the benefit of the doubt. Again, this is primarily on the RedBend client. Found that the SSL hostname verification was hard-coded to true. That means that any legitimate certificate, such as badhacker.com, will be accepted as your carrier's server. Fun stuff there. Now on iOS, a little bit different. iOS has a little bit better SSL controls since they are not running Java. But if needed, all you need to do is provide a carrier mobile configuration pop-up. So if you're man in the middling, it'll pop up the screen saying update to this carrier setting, and you now have a certificate on that device and can man in the middle. Now, a little bit more worrying than even that is test servers left in the configuration on production devices. Large amount of production devices have hard-coded HTTP test servers leading to redbend.com. Live servers there, apparently, but what these can be used for is downgrade attacks. I can send your device a WAP, tell it to connect to RedBend, and because it's using HTTP, it will then be quite easily man in the middle. Or it is quite possible that RedBend could also send your device, though I have no idea about that. But pretty much with anyone man in the middling, DNS control can do it. That example up there, which I apologize y'all can't see very well, is an Android 4.4.4 device, though it was responsibly disclosed many, many months ago. Not sure why it's still there. Okay, let's go into abusing some of the standard functionality. global provisioning and Bootstrap. So, many devices can be re-provisioned with a single WAP push, or in certain cases, an SMS. All that would be needed is that authentication that we talked about a few minutes ago, the whole IMEI and shared secret key that we all know. That is the only thing protecting many global devices from being reconfigured. Pretty much at the minimum, that would give an attacker the ability to easily and persistently have a man in the middle on your device without a BTS. I send your device a new request, tell it, hey, you are now supposed to talk to these proxies and these routes and these APNs. And boom, your device now talks to them. It will hold them. And, you know, a lot of times it will even carry through factory reset. So you could be man in the middle and have no idea. Other fun ones, inside-out baseband attacks. So talked a little bit about this earlier, but these agents have very privileged access to baseband. They literally can read, write, modify NVRAM parameters, the EFS, and a bunch of other low-level settings. Some of them pass data via the EMCC itself, so say the carrier partition or persist. This can be leveraged both ways. So radio can write to it, or userland can write to it, and can be used for privilege escalation from, say, radio to userland. Though be very careful playing with these settings. You will end up with brick devices. I have plenty of them. I don't know if I can expense any more, and Google probably won't send me any more replacements for my broken devices. Okay, another interesting one. Carrier customizations. So what we found in one of the major US carriers is something called, according to their actual code, chameleon, or carrier branding. Pretty much it's used for MVNOs. You all have a fair amount of those out here, mobile virtual network operators. So it can perform things like call intercept. At first, that really freaked me out, because that's literally the functionality's name. It's not as bad as you'd think. It just allows any number you dial to be redirected to an intent that they send. So you dial 123, and it now starts whatever application I send. As well as a bunch of other fun customizations that you can read in the list later on. Things like device self-service, another lovely carrier addition. VMS, which is a visual voicemail APK on US devices and depending on some global. That's a very interesting application. There's a lot in there. I definitely recommend looking at it, as well as a bunch of other things. That two pictures there are just a small list of functionality that can be found by dumping out the client. So I'm going to do a little demo. So in this demo, I am going to show what is an NIA-based lock screen bypass. It's built-in carrier functionality. I am sending 2 WAP pushes to these devices. We have an LG G2 and an Android Nexus 5, both stock in there. Let's see if it actually continues running. There we go. So pretty much just sitting there. They're both connected to my BTS. I now send a WAP push to both devices. Wait for it to go over the network. Again, these are GPRS GSM devices, and they're pretty slow. But boom, both lock screens off. That was with a single WAP, or what would be pretty much an SMS-style payload, unauthenticated. And those were both locked. So I hope you really trust your carrier with your lock screens. Now, and you get, when you see it, depending on the setting for that, I am showing a lovely update device error. Now it's a little bit blurry on this screen. So, finishing up the built-in functionality section. There are 4 major ways I found that someone can achieve code execution on your device without memory corruption. SCOMO, software management made easy for carriers and attackers. Chameleon, all you have to do is rebrand the device, say, hey, you're on a new MVNO, I need you to install new applications. Intent proxies. So the little call intercept, just put an intent in there saying install this file that I pushed down somewhere else. And finally, built-in functionality from which is all stemmed. Firmware over there updates. Who here runs assigned firmware on their device? Feel free to raise your hand if you're actually running assigned firmware. Okay, well, seems like no one is, so that means if you have an OMA-DM client on your device and you're not running signed firmware, such as actually from a manufacturer, no firmware signing means I can just push my own firmware to your device and have it update. So, unfortunately, making your own modifications to devices at the same time protect you or don't. And this is also very relevant on embedded devices, as their firmware verification is nowhere near what a phone is. Okay, go into what I like to call tactical exploitation. Let's talk about some of the more in-depth vulnerabilities found. Okay. These are the different types of exploitable vulnerabilities found in many OMA-DM clients when it comes to memory corruption. Buffer overflows, heap corruption, integer overflows, format string issues, arbitrary reads, invalid freeze, and more. And one thing I would like to remind y'all, many OMA-DM clients are built on the same code base. That means those transfer between devices. I'm going to go into a lovely little example. This is actually probably one of my favorite bugs that we saw. It is, here. By more or less making a custom WBXML payload, modifying one of the string tables location, so it's pretty much an integer overflow. You can read backwards in memory. It's somewhat seemingly benign, but I think a little bit later you'll understand more. What it will do is return the attacker controlled amount of memory above or under which it could be read, so depending on where you are in your memory allocation. But what is also interesting is I can create payloads using this that can read thousands of different locations of memory at one time. So if I need to scan through memory for something, which we'll talk about later, makes it quite easy. Well, another thing I will note is this was on the RedBend version v4, which is still on many, many new devices, though a minor change was made on RedBend v5. Not sure why that change is not fully propagated yet, though it's been out for, I think, over a year and a half or more. Okay, so talk a little bit about what we're going to do in over-there attacks and how to deal with exploit mitigations. So a couple of the interesting weaknesses I found while working on this is on iOS, the malloc large memory regions are very deterministic. Pretty much you can watch the allocations happen and know where they will be. And that makes for very interesting times. Also, bottom picture, I don't know how well you can see it again. I apologize. An interesting thing on iOS's compiler, if it can't quite understand how the levels of abstraction over a function, the built-in overflow protections for things like strcat will be negated. It will insert a -1 in there, and meaning anything can be passed to it. So we now have overflow protections gone and help with ASLR. Now on Android, something that hasn't been talked about very much. Many of Android applications which are spawned by Zygote can be their stack cookie can be brute forced on average within 512 attempts. As long as there's no 0 at the end or ending or trailing 0, you can brute force this cookie in 512 tries. Also, the ASLR on Android is pretty low entropy and can be brute forced too. So, I'm going to go into actually chaining vulnerabilities for code execution. Okay, so kind of going through the whole talk, we'll start with a stateless WAP push. Send a WAP to the device. It will either come in via an NIA or a Bootstrap. If you have to, you can bypass authentication. Again, using the vulnerability that talked about in authentication, which is a broken authentication measure. This is not something that's just like, oops, a mistake in code. This is broken auth implementation across all clients that I've seen. So it's not even just one company. That's carrier mandated stuff, though. Now, after we've woken up the client, it will respond. So if by chance it's using SSL, just bypass it. A couple of ways already listed. So now we have actual access to the client. I will note that differences in environments can drastically affect the stability of exploitation. So we're talking, cellular timing delays, multiple threads running, memory layouts. Many, many things can affect it. Or in the case of when I originally tried to present this at Black Hat USA, was going to do live demos, but on top of some other AV issues, my BTS got somewhat DDoSed. I asked everyone to turn off their phones, yet 70 devices were actively trying to camp on my base station. And this was a completely locked down base station. So you never know with cellular environments what you're going to have to deal with. It's not stable, not a fun thing to have to deal with instability. Okay, so let's go into the nitty-gritty of the actual exploitation process. Let's start with finding the stack. So most stacks on iOS are near the malloc large memory regions. And remember what mentioned earlier. Malloc large memory regions are somewhat deterministic. So using what we call OTA, Feng Shui, we leverage more or less different size allocations as well as arbitrary reads and memory peaks to find out where we are. And if not, we'll just brute force it. Now on Android, it's a little bit different, but overall, ASLR is pretty weak, so don't have too much issues. And right above the stack is a static data file that can be used as a landing pad. So if you aim for it, it will then help you find where your target location needs to go. Now, we've got to find the code section, because latest devices have fun memory protections. We found that the OMA-DM client has a bunch of function pointers all over the heap. These function pointers point to part of its state machine, but what that gives us is the ability to know exactly where in memory the code is. each allocated node of the tree actually gets its own set of function pointers. And using those function pointers, we can then subtract the offset to get the base address of your code section. That's more on iOS, but same kind of concepts apply on Android. Well, what about canaries? So talked about where we are in memory. Now, what do we do about actual canary? Well, that's an interesting one. They are present on multiple locations in certain stacks. The main thread stack, unfortunately, is in a high location. In memory, can't be directly accessed by the lovely control read that we showed you earlier. No, though pthreads allocates new stacks directly on the heap. These are typically on lower locations in memory, which can be read by the arbitrary read. Accessible stack canaries are also at semi-determinable locations. So, combination of the arbitrary read, deterministic memory layouts, and stack cookies gives us ASLR and stack protection bypassed. That's on multiple platforms. Okay, well, we have ASLR and stack. Now what? We have to build ROP. So, ROP chains are very time-consuming, especially on iOS. We built a tool to automate it for us. Using multiple layers of abstraction, we generate large amount of ROP chains with what available gadgets are possible, or we have. We also pass it the ASLR slide, location to code section, cookies, max side of the chain, and it will then create our different payloads and also pivot if we want to. What's lovely is we can store multiple ROP chains in the OMA-DM client itself. It has the built-in functionality to read or to store data as base64, then read it out as raw data into memory. So you can literally push ROP payloads into its config file and read them back out whenever I need to. And once all of them are stored, you can use just a single small payload that will do a stack pivot onto any of the ones that we have in there. So you want different payloads or multi-phases, it's all built into the lovely OMA-DM client itself. It's an example. Sorry, it's somewhat cut out for safety reasons, but using different call overloads, store, pivot pointers, pretty much you can see the output and the input. Abstracted layers of code. These are the different function calls we want. Hey, we want to do an fopen or file write, and then it will check. It will go ahead and convert all zeros in the payload to ensure we don't run into termination string issues. Make basic gadgets, parse them. Great. And I will say thank you again to Mark. He was super involved on this. This was his baby, and he really did an awesome job. So let's talk about where code execution was obtained. This is the list of devices that we currently have code execution on. iOS, Android, BlackBerry, multiple cellular hotspots, laptops with WWAN, M10, and IoT basebands. This is live code execution. But as part of our responsible disclosure process, and in order to protect the public, we have to withhold detailed vulnerability information on many phones and other devices. Unfortunately, many devices have not been patched yet. Carrier life cycles are very long. So, as far as I know, not one yet. Okay. Unfortunately, this is kind of hard to see, and I apologize. But we'll see how well it'll go. So, what I am doing here is I am sending a WAP NIA to an iOS device. You can kind of see it there at the bottom. The first section of what's actually going on here, sorry I paused it, is leaking the ASLR slide. So initial WAP to NIA, WAP NIA, wake up the client. Client talks to the server, now leak the slide, let it go, and boom. What's there is the function pointers talked about earlier. So those now gave us locations to the code section. Under that is the actual ASLR offset. After this, go ahead and crash the actual agent. Want a clean slate for memory. Oh, crap. Sorry. Just the wrong button. So from there, restart the agent. It's going to take a while, so I'm going to speed it up. That's the issue with testing on GPRS. Very, very slow. Okay. So the rest of this. Incoming request. From there, since we already have ASLR, start searching for the stack cookie using the same arbitrary read as earlier. Just have to know where they are. And we were able to, on iOS 7.1, use a static offset. It was actually very helpful. After that, make sure it's actually a cookie, not random data. So check the entropy. From there, go ahead and create and push the different payloads that we talked about earlier using ROP generation. Push dylib. And let it go. It's sitting, running in the background. Pretty much all of the overflows are happening now. Takes a little bit. More or less, we have an overflow. It is then using the dylib pushed to inject into certain functionality on the device. Hit write protection and privilege escalate, and boom. Now have root on an previously unjailbroken iOS device. Reason I focus on iOS, it's the hardest one. Same technique can be used on every other platform. So yeah, we now have a jailbroken iOS device that this same stuff will also work on iOS 8 if someone feels like playing with it, though I will not be releasing any of the code. So yeah, just in case, you can see on the bottom, restarted Springboard, and there you go. That was all done via GPRS. Okay, so that's pretty much it for my talk. Again, this code base is on pretty much all devices that run OMA-DM. Vulnerabilities found are cross-platform. So I find a buffer overflow on one, it affects the other. That means that list of vulnerabilities is affecting currently about up to 1.8 or so billion devices. And the code bases are pretty much the same. So BlackBerry, iOS, Android, whatever. Someone looks at this, finds bugs, they'll get into it too. But I guess in the end, really, why is this there in the first place? Why do carriers have the ability to install applications on your device? Who here knew this was already there prior to this talk? One person. Or two. So, two people out of the whole room at Black Hat knew that built-in functionality to manage and install applications as other sensitive information was on our personal devices. Well, I don't know about y'all. I don't necessarily like the thought of that. I want to know what's happening on my device. But that's not for me to go into. And yeah, I just want to say thanks again to pretty much all of Acuant Labs. We've got an amazing team over there. Ryan, Alex, Pete, just a whole bunch of people. The prior researchers, MSEC Labs did really good work in 2011 or 2009, which is actually the first time that the authentication issues were brought up in the OMA-CP clients. So I guess we're in, 2014? 5 years or so now. those clients have been publicly known, or those authentication issues have been publicly known and not had anything done about. Nico Goldie and Colin Moliner, Harold Walt, all the OpenBSC, Dino Zovi, Charlie Miller, all of Asimov stuff. They're just completely published gold. Luis Miras, Jay Case, Kasos, who else? Ralph Philip Weinman. And I do want to note a couple of the carriers and vendors that during disclosure, which was really, really painful, went the extra mile. Qualcomm, great team over there. They always on top of the ball. They need to be teaching classes on how to run a disclosure program because they are the best I've seen for this process. Apple, AT&T, BlackBerry, Samsung, Verizon. Those are, again, other ones that we really appreciate. Oh yeah, one more thing. Wasn't the only one found. There are other control protocols out there. And that's it.